I'm also a research associate in the Glenn Black Lab of Archaeology here, and this is related to that, right? So I'm really going to be talking about ceramics cultivation community, so a lot about the dynamics and a lot about networking, and specifically exchange networks that relate to the transition to agriculture and how it spread in the old world. So we'll start with a little introduction for those people who are not archaeologists about archaeology and how we as archaeologists try to integrate data at multiple scales, very complex data, and that's how we try to tell our stories about what happened in the past. We have certainly things that happen at the environmental scale. This is at a very broad macro-environmental scale, but also micro-environmental scales. At geographic scales, that includes geologic and geographic information. Obviously, we're social scientists. We look at the economic, social, and political spheres of interaction. We also deal very much, since we dig things up, we deal with the technical and the domestic layers very much, and these look at technologies and household organization, things like sites that we dig up and the spatial structure of those, as well as the stuff that we find. And at the individual, right? Ultimately, one of the things we're trying to, a lot through inference, is looking at people as independent agents and how they interact with these other layers, right? So in environmental, we have things like this. This is the peak glaciation, the very last one. As you look here is Europe, kind of mostly under from central France up, but not so much over here, as I'll talk about. That will become important later. And you can see also in North America, we don't really care about them today. And then we also look at how were these environments reconstructed? What was the environment like? We have these kind of vegetative landscapes that we try to reimagine based on pollen that we reconstruct for the most part. And then, of course, we have animal bones that we find at our sites, and we understand particularly for the fauna that people would have interacted with. And, of course, sometimes we have plant remains as well, so we can try to understand what kinds of natural environments and how people are interacting with them. At the geographic scale, I'm doing a lot with ceramics, so I cared a lot about the geology of the area I was looking at, and here we are looking at Iberia, so that's going to be where I'm focusing the first story that I'm telling today. You also have a very significant geographic component to as well, mountains, plains, lacustrine areas, and so that is a very important part of what we try to understand when we reconstruct past activities at a smaller scale. You might down here see that you have a highland area and a lowland area, and people where they decide to settle, how they decide to utilize the resources in the landscape, how they interact with each other because of that is important. And then even at just the site level, what's the dirt in the ground? What are the soils like? How does it relate to the local geography? Is it like in this situation where it's at a point overlooking a small isthmus? How does that interact? How does that affect what was going on in the past? Right? How can we help use these kind of information to interpret the past? So economic, social, and political. Here's a Neolithic, and all these examples, these images I'm showing you are all. One of the things I wanted to try to do is give you a flavor for the scale and the types of artifacts and things that we see in the Mesolithic, the end of the period right before agriculture, and then the Neolithic, the first period of agriculture. So these are all also to kind of give you a flavor of the scale of the societies that we're talking about. This is an early Neolithic goddess that was a religious object. Over here we see, the classic small megalithic tomb that you would see all throughout southwestern Europe. And this represents some of the religious burial practices that they had, some of the social status you see in some of these things that we pull up from graves. And then also just on the economic side, this is a shell midden. These when the sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, it created a lot of lacustrine estuarine areas that created a bounty of shells. And so before agriculture arrived in a lot of areas in southwestern Europe, you would have these very massive and sometimes massive shell middens that were inhabited by people. And so this was an important part, an environmental dynamic that affected the economy of what happened right before the agricultural transition. So in terms of technic and domestic, what we see in the Western Mediterranean is people living in these small little caves on the uplands, or even just rock shelters. And then as there's a transition to the Neolithic, you have this is a kind of poor example by archaeologists trying to replicate what was an early Neolithic structure might have looked like. It's kind of dumpy looking. But but you have these kind of wattle and daub structures that start to appear. And Italy, there's one in Italy that's a particular note. And then on the more the technic side, you see this is what we have for tools. This is mostly what we discover in the Mesolithic. That's it. We have caves, we have dead people, we have the stuff they ate, and we have little lithic fragments. These are transverse arrowheads that were very popular in the late Mesolithic. And then in the Neolithic, you start to get groundstone tools that to appear, and of course pottery. And we're going to talk a lot about pottery as we move forward. So at the individual level, you have certain things where you do have documents of individual activity, such as this little lithic chipping station. This is where somebody sat down with a piece of stone that could make into a stone tool, and they chipped it into a stone tool. And here's a little lithic scatter that represents a very rare but unique kind of point in time where we see the activity of one person in one little spot of time. And then we also have kind of at a broader scale, we'll have models where we're looking at places where people would live and individual choices about what kinds of resources they might go after in terms of collecting seeds. Are they hunting large game? Are they going to the lake to fish? Or are they going to the river to fish? And so these are kind of parts of the models that we use that really represent individual actions as well. And of course, here we have the people themselves. We do find people, and we know a lot about them. Their physiology by looking at the remains that they leave behind. And here's an example of something that happened with the early Neolithic, which is an increase in caries and dental disease that happened once they started moving from a meat and seed diet to one that was based on cultivated grains. They start to develop an increase in caries and disease, which was you would think that, I mean, they still grew, but the population still expanded, but there were some negatives too that came about with agriculture. So this is kind of what we see, trying to pull all of these individual levels. So what I'm trying to do is just give you context of what we're dealing with here at the transition to agriculture, these periods of time, the scale of the societies, what we're finding, so that when we're talking in the next section about what went on during the dynamic, you people who are not archaeologists can put this in a little bit better context. So here's the classic model of the agricultural revolution in the old world. Ancient hydraulic civilizations. Plants and animals were domesticated in the Near East. That actually is not going to change to the point of this talk. With domestication, industries like ceramics could begin. And then at 9000 BP, the agricultural revolution began. It spread across Europe and with the diffusion of pottery, domesticated plants and animals. And then this provided the economic basis for the world as we know it today. So I'm ignoring the information world, right? But basically, we're an agricultural-based society. So that's kind of where we are. So this is an important transition, right? A very seminal transition in prehistory. And that's the classic model. So if we look at then to my area, where I'm interested in, I study this area in southwestern France and into Iberia. If you look at, you see agriculture spread in Europe as a package of domesticates and cereals. It means they all came in at the same time. You have, in the Western Mediterranean, you have domesticated sheep or goats. Sometimes it's difficult to pick them out from their remains. And you have pottery, and then you start to have settled village agriculture. And here, this yellow area is the area that I studied. And the reason it's yellow is because it's characterized by a distinct type of ceramic. And then you have other areas here in the Aegean, and then another area up here, the linear band ceramic culture across Central Europe. And so you really see kind of three different areas, and there are some proposed paths of spread that are there that show how domesticates and ceramics and basically agricultural societies spread across Europe. So let's look at the differences between these two societies really quickly. In the Mesolithic, so that's pre-agricultural, you have hunting and foraging. You have seasonal settlements, we don't know, because with the rise of the sea levels, not only do we have great shell middens, but we also lost a lot of sites. If they were living in the coast in the Mesolithic, those are now underwater, so they're very difficult to discover in the Western Mediterranean. Flakestone tools, you saw some of those. No evidence really of trade. Extended family groups is what we think based on the scale of the settlements that we discovered. And then we find sites in upland caves and then these kind of coastal shell middens. That's kind of the settlement patterns that we see. So on the Neolithic, here's a slight comparison. We have domesticated wheat and barley and sheep and goats in the Western Mediterranean. There's cows and pigs in Northern Europe, but in the Western Mediterranean, we get sheep and goats. Year-round villages, eventually. Flakestone tools continue with pottery, and then some groundstone comes in a little bit after the pottery. Regional trade and exotics, we see that, so we have evidence of trade, but I will also contend as part of this that one of the reasons we see regional trade in exotic is because we have exotics that we can actually trace. Whereas before you didn't really have much. It's very difficult to trace flakestone tools. Tribal level societies, so this is something basically clan-based societies that we're looking at. Coastal sites and upland caves, very similar to what you had before, and then eventually you have these kind of lowland villages that start to appear, these kind of ugly wattle and daub things, right? So let's look at it then from a model standpoint. How do we use networks? How do we use exchange networks, particularly to try to help understand the dynamic that happened? Because for me, this is a very important change, right? A very important dynamic that happens when agriculture comes into an area. The classic model of the spread of agriculture is, hey, we had agriculture, these agricultural populations spread across Western Europe and manifested their destiny, and the hunters and gatherers that were already living in place, they really weren't considered as part of the model. So now I'm considering them as part of the model. That's kind of the point of this, and we're looking at what kinds of networks of exchange do we have that were going on. So here's the classic model, Ammerman and Cavalli-Sforza's endemic diffusion model, where you have this big red blob of Neolithic agriculturalists. They move into an area. Their social structures, their political structures, their ethnicity, and their economy is very different and foreign from the existing populations, and so they move them out. These guys, these little blue dots of hunters and gatherers, move out. That contrasts to a model of adoption of these economies and technologies by affluent foragers. So here these were passive people who were acted upon by agriculturalists. These were participants in the process, where you would have a large agricultural group that would move into the area. They would interact with these blue dots, the hunters and gatherers, and they turn them purple, right? So they would start to adopt technologies. And then you have these models of affluent foragers from Brian Hayden, and then through this kind of down-the-line exchange that was proposed by Colin Renfrew in the 70s. So let's see how this worked out. So what I studied, I looked at ceramics, and the reason I looked at ceramic was they persist. All we had in the Mesolithic were a few flakestone tools and dead people and dead animals. And then their production locations can be discovered, so we know where they were made, where they were transferred. So that's very important for looking at interaction patterns. The fact they can be used for storage and cooking is an important economic benefit. They are easily decorated and so carry personal, social, and political messages. So we have a lot of information that comes with them in terms of why they were made and the messages they would carry with them. They have a technological style, and so reflect manufacturing tradition as well. So we can also look at the economy of manufacturing that comes with ceramics. So they're great, right? We just didn't have anything before. So here's basically what I did for my dissertation, was looking at the spread of the pink down here, the cardial ware, what's called cardial ceramics and early impressed wares across the Western Mediterranean. Now, this happened very, very fast. From here in Liguria, we have sites that don't date. They date maybe 150 years earlier than dates that we get here in Portugal. So that's pretty fast for agriculture to spread all the way across the Western Mediterranean. And in fact, if you look at some of the radiocarbon dating, radiocarbon dates are plus or minus 100 years. So you've got 150 years of spread plus or minus 100 years, which is, so that's really fast. And if you look at the endemic diffusion models, they're looking at rates of 1 kilometer per year. That's what Ammerman and Cavalli-Sforza predicted. So this is a lot faster than that. This is on the order of 5 to 10 kilometers a year. But what you also have to understand is 100 years, that's 5 generations. So for us to project this onto some kind of model of interaction is very difficult. So if you look at the pottery discovered, the first kinds of pottery you have are these kind of le vrai cardial, the true cardial pottery. And it has a distinct manufacturing style, distinct decoration, very uniform decoration, and the paste is very uniform as well, and it's spread very quickly across the Western Mediterranean. So we call this a kind of trans-regional exchange. Then, as you start to get these, as ceramics get established, you start to in my opinion, get local production. They still try to emulate this style, but they're manufactured locally, they're exchanged regionally, but they still have a lot of decoration, and they're still traded about some. And then the last phase, where you start to get to the end of the early Neolithic, it's just they're not decorated, they're very functional, they're not traded at all, and you can see that these two, why are they nice? Well, they were found in burial contexts. Why is this one all busted up and they only have a black and white photo of it? Because it came out of a domestic context. So they're now found in different kinds of contexts as well. So how does this relate to network models of spread? So we were talking a little bit about the kind of the down the line model, and this would be an example of a down the line model that of a network that would result in kind of moving down the chain. And you see this, I think, with some of the regional ceramics, but I don't think they don't get very far there. This was created to explain the exchange of obsidian, which is a volcanic glass, which is very nice because you have point sources. You have on the island of Milos, you will have obsidian, and then if you want to get access to that obsidian, you have to get to it. You have to exchange it all the way kind of down a series of connections to get there. Ceramics don't work. Ceramics would interfere with this network because you would have popping up here local centers of production, and so that would tend to disrupt the model. But if you look at the le vrai cardial, right, the true cardial, the first pottery that comes in, you start to see network patterns like this, where you have people kind of jumping, right? This kind of small worlds kind of model, where people are jumping and the ceramics are moving long distances, which for me also helps to support, my contention that it was exchange rather than dystemic diffusion or this kind of march of agriculturalists into the area. So, if we look to the east, right, then we see they did have agricultural societies before this, much earlier than this, and here's just a map of them, kind of in the Near East, and here's the hilly flanks where they first domesticated wheats and barleys, and they have very complex societies. They had big settlements, and they even have kind of religious iconography. This is kind of ox-related iconography, but they didn't have ceramics. Yet they were still able to create fairly complex and fairly large-scale societies all the way around through the Near East. So how do we then look at a situation where you have a possibility of hunters and gatherers adopting pottery in the Western Mediterranean? You have obviously people who don't need pottery to have a complex agricultural society. So how does this then work out in terms of a larger context? So this is my fun slide, right? So here we are looking at all of Eurasia. Archaeologists from here to here, it's about maybe a fifth of the area in question, hundreds of them have been working for hundreds of years and trying to pull together the cultural histories of this area. And here we have 9,000 BP, and it's orange because it's an agricultural setting. You have ceramics appearing in the Middle East, right? So what we also had was a curious phenomenon of at 13,000 BP, you have this other ceramic culture appearing right at the end of the Ice Age, Jomon in Japan. And these were always treated as separate phenomena. But with the fall of the Soviet Union and with the opening up of China, now we have 20 or 30 years of non-communist doctrine archaeology that's gone on. We start to have some dates coming out from the gap in between. So what we have is 18,000 BP. So pottery appearing in hunter-gatherers in context, and this is important for two reasons. One, you really have pottery appearing in hunter-gatherers context, and you have it during the middle of the Ice Age. Remember, I talked about the Ice Age kind of coming down through here, right, and up through here. Well, you didn't have much of an ice sheet in this area, right, but you did in Europe. So 14,000 BP up on the northern coast of China. 10,000 BP made it down into Korea. 10,000 BP into eastern Siberia, which you would find eastern Siberia is not a very welcoming climate. 9,000 BP up in the northern Caspian Sea. And then 8,000 BP then in eastern Siberia. So the story here is you have ceramics in a completely different context, a completely different period of time that look, to my mind, as if they are being exchanged in being exchanged through agricultural, through hunters and gatherers groups, all the way west to suddenly they get to here about the same time that ceramics were supposedly invented by these agricultural societies that, according to the theory that we have in place, the original theory, the classic theory, only complex societies can invent ceramics. Okay, great, that's great. I'm going to not even take that long. So where do we see this manifested later? We see this in the Silk Road, right? We could see that we have people in the Pleistocene and people later on who are using the same kinds of exchange routes, right, at probably smaller scales. If you look at the model that we looked at for obsidian exchange, they were much, much smaller scale, and so it did not move as fast. But still, you can see that there were routes and there are ways to get innovations from the east, from the way east, far east, all the way to the Middle East. Right? So we know that those things could have moved along those routes. So my new model, and it's based on looking at networks of exchange and using those as models to look at how agriculture could have spread, and is that hunters and gatherers invented ceramics during the last ice age. But plants and animals were domesticated in the Near East, supporting complex societies. Then, through exchange networks, ceramic containers, and I'm saying this, the vessels are containers because they do have they do have a lot of function, arrived to the Near East, sparking the agricultural revolution across Europe and other areas. So really, it's a matter of not everything happening in the Near East and then all of a sudden it's spreading out from there, but it's really a matter of agricultural societies coming into place in the Near East, and then an innovation arrives through these exchange networks from some other place entirely, and that's what sparked the agricultural revolution across the old world, right? And this provided the economic basis for the world as we know it today. So that's my story, and I'm trying to take some network stuff and apply it and show how we as archaeologists use them to better understand what went on in the past. So that's my presentation. And I'm happy to take questions.
I have a silly question. So what is the now proper language for what BP? What is that?
Okay, so the question is, so this is being recorded. The question is, what do you use BP for? So people who work in the Pleistocene use BP before present, and present has typically been 1950 when radiocarbon dating was invented. And now they keep extending that back a little bit, but really that's 1950. But people who have worked on extending chronologies from dated times, for example, Roman, Greek, and then extending those back and trying to make a connection to the present, they've used BC because they use calendar dates. So BC before Christ, BP before present. So it's just a matter, and there's a conflict between those two traditions of dating.
So where is before the Common Era?
BCE, I think that's more related to BC than it is, more BC than it is BP.
When people say before the Common Era, that's a more politically correct way of saying before Christ.
That's right. That's exactly right. Did you have a question? Sorry.
There was no Africa in your...
There was no what?
Africa.
There was no Africa. Well, if you looked, actually, I can't go back. But if you looked at the cardial map I did, the cardial pottery did extend across and hit a lot of North Africa. And if I had more time, we could talk about indirect evidence for boats and why that might have led to the increase, the rate of change and the rate of spread. So, but there was Africa. It's generally, a lot of times sub-Saharan Africa is ignored, but a lot of African, and there is some early pottery too in Egypt, but I wanted to keep my model just within the area. But there is a lot of early pottery, early impressed wares, early cardial pottery in North Africa as well. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it seems like in the nature of your work, there's going to be an awful lot of missing links in sort of networks such as paucity and connections. So how do you integrate that into your explanatory models that you're going to have so much missing data? Certain kinds of missing data is okay, but other kinds is problematic. I mean, how do you make that sort of gap?
Well, I tried to do it by working at 2 scales, and one, kind of the original model I built when I was looking at the Western Mediterranean, I was able to do that at a fairly small scale because there was a lot of sites. They've been well excavated. The French are actually very good technical archaeologists. Well, yeah, so that's why I took that model that was fairly well known, and then I tried to layer that over a larger expanse. And the reason that you don't have that many dates coming from Eurasia is because they've only been doing very few people only doing archaeology for a couple decades, right? Since that was the kind of non-communist archaeology. So and one of the reasons why is because the communist doctrine is that agriculturists, they replace the original affluent forager, right? The original affluent person who was the model for communism. So if you have, before the agricultural revolution, you have people who were practicing things that they would have seen as capitalistic practices. That doesn't really work very well. So those types of questions were not explored. And so once these kind of political changes happened, and we all of a sudden have Eurasia to start to mine from in terms of, and we have archaeologists who are now starting to work. That's when you start to see these dates coming out. But so what I did try to do is take a relatively well-studied area at a small scale and then just basically project that model over a larger area and say, yeah, we don't have that many dates yet, we don't have that much information yet, but the model does seem to hold, and then as more dates come in, we'll have a better ability in the future to test those models. Yes?
So you're talking about the tree. We presume that the tree moved in tandem?
I'm sorry?
The community part of it.
Yes?
One assumes that the tree moved in tandem?
Which? Yes.
Does the Neolithic, for example, the domestication of wild species, if we take in our context, that's the subcontinent, we take mRNA form, for example, going from the wild species to the domesticated species. Similarly, for the other flora, the other fauna, can one say that moved parallelly with development in community life? Was there any evidence that the three moved together?
So there is evidence in the Western Mediterranean of domesticated plants and animals coming together as a package because they all appear at the same time in the same levels in archaeological sites. What's not clear is, and that's kind of where I was trying to take some of the modeling, looking at these networks to try to understand what the dynamics might have been and see, did the community change, right? Because that, I think, is the question mark, and that's something where, because of the inundation of the sites in the Mesolithic and because we don't have evidence of exchange for the Mesolithic, that's all a blank for us, and we're trying to look at the patterns to see when that happened. Now, if you look at the early Neolithic, that's a perfect slide, thank you. So this happened about BC, 5500 BC, and by 4500 BC, you have these more functional pots, and that's actually, it's only then, about 1,000 years later, that you start to have the appearance of settled villages in the Western Mediterranean. So the question of what happened during this 1,000-year period where you have this transition is still an open question. And so when you look at what are the models for kind of demic diffusion, agriculturalists moving in versus the adoption, you're looking at really something that began very quickly in terms of the domesticates and the pottery coming in, but took a long time to actually manifest itself into settled agriculture.
Japan really confuses everything because you don't have the Neolithic at all. We're not talking of an agricultural revolution there.
That's correct.
And yet very, very ancient pottery.
That's correct. That's correct.
Not for either of these reasons. They're not storage. They're not cooking.
So the model that I had for why would a hunter and gathering population need to have ceramic containers in the Ice Age? Is that your question? And so I think the models that they're looking at, it's for rendering and storing fish oils because a lot of these are coastal sites. And so they would use it to store them to keep them over winter. So it was storage of foodstuffs primarily. Yes.
More likely non-functional.
Well, so the very first ceramics in every context are always very, very highly decorated. And then, as you see here, it's just like the Western Mediterranean. This repeats itself all over the world with Lapita and Oceania, and then with some of the early ceramics in Mesoamerica. They all repeat this. The first appearance of an innovation is always very highly decorated. It's always very high prized. It doesn't mean they didn't have function. There are some, we do get some soot deposits on the insides of even these earliest vessels. They were used for things, but they were very rare and of great import. Okay, thanks.